The chilly morning air hung heavy over Jefferson High School as students hustled through the hallways, their chatter tinged with nervous energy. Today was midterm day, and the tension was palpable. Ethan Carter, a confident senior with sharp features and a reputation for speaking his mind, strode toward his history exam room. As always, perched proudly on his head was his red MAGA hat, its bold white lettering drawing glances from passing students. Some looked on with curiosity, others with quiet disapproval, but Ethan barely noticed. The hat wasn't just an accessory, it was a statement. He reached the exam room, clutching his notebook, only to be met by the imposing figure of Principal Donna Wilson. Known for her strict adherence to rules, Wilson was not one to tolerate anything she perceived as a disruption. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on Ethan. "Ethan," she said, her tone sharp and controlled, "you'll need to remove that hat before entering the exam room." Ethan stopped, frowning in confusion. "Why? I've worn this hat plenty of times before, and it's never been a problem." Principal Wilson's gaze didn't falter. "The school dress code prohibits clothing with political messages. Today is an exam day, and I won't allow anything that might distract or upset other students. Take it off, or you won't be allowed to take your test." Ethan's heart pounded with a mix of disbelief and anger. "Principal Wilson, with all due respect, this is a violation of my rights. I'm not disrupting anyone. It's just a hat." "Rules are rules, Ethan," she said firmly. "If you refuse to comply, you're free to leave." The hallway grew quieter as a few students paused to watch the exchange. Ethan felt his face flush with frustration. He wanted to argue further, but he knew it wouldn't get him anywhere. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked away, his steps heavy with humiliation and rage. He made it outside the building before pulling out his phone. His first thought was to call his father. James Carter wasn't just a concerned parent. He was the mayor of the city, a man known for his calm demeanor and commitment to fairness. Ethan's voice shook with frustration as he recounted the incident. "They wouldn't even let me take the test, Dad," he said, pacing near the school's flagpole. "She said my hat was against the rules, but I've worn it before. This isn't about the dress code. She's targeting me." On the other end of the line, James Carter listened intently, his tone steady but firm. "Stay where you are," he said after a moment. "I'll be there soon." Ethan hung up and stood waiting, his breath visible in the crisp air. He replayed the conversation with Principal Wilson in his mind, his frustration growing with each passing minute. By the time his father's sleek black sedan pulled into the school parking lot, Ethan's anger had reached a boiling point. James Carter stepped out of the car in a tailored suit, exuding an air of authority that turned heads even in the parking lot. His expression was calm, but his sharp eyes betrayed his determination. "Let's go," he said simply, placing a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. Inside the school, the atmosphere shifted the moment they entered. Teachers whispered among themselves, students craned their necks to get a better look, and Principal Wilson appeared visibly unsettled when she saw the mayor approaching. James Carter requested a private meeting, and within minutes, the principal's office was filled with tension. "Principal Wilson," James began, his tone polite but firm. "My son tells me he was barred from taking his exam because of his hat. I'd like to hear your reasoning." Wilson straightened her posture, her professionalism returning. "Mr. Carter, the school's dress code explicitly states that clothing with political slogans is not permitted. The rule is in place to maintain a neutral environment and prevent any potential conflicts." James nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I understand the need for neutrality, Principal Wilson. But if this rule has been in place all year, why was it only enforced today?" Wilson faltered for a moment. Well, it's especially important on exam days, when tensions are already high. We want to minimize distractions." "Minimizing distractions is one thing," James replied, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "But infringing on a student's right to express himself is another. This is a public school, Principal Wilson. Ethan's hat may not be to everyone's liking, but it doesn't violate his constitutional rights unless you can prove it caused a significant disruption. From what I've heard, you cannot. The room fell silent. Ethan watched as Principal Wilson's confidence wavered, her expression tightening under the weight of the mayor's words. "This isn't just about my son," James continued. "It's about setting a precedent. If you can single him out today, what's stopping you from doing the same to another student tomorrow?" Ethan felt a surge of pride as he listened to his father. He had never doubted James Carter's ability to command a room, but seeing it firsthand was something else entirely. The principal opened her mouth to respond, but the knock at the door interrupted her. The school board chair, having caught wind of the situation, stepped into the room, his expression a mix of concern and authority. "I think we need to discuss this further," he said, looking between the principal and the mayor. Ethan exchanged a glance with his father, sensing that the battle had only just begun. The tension in Principal Wilson's office was palpable, the kind of charged atmosphere that seemed to shrink the room. Ethan sat silently beside his father, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Principal Wilson remained behind her desk, her carefully composed expression betraying just a flicker of unease as the school board chair, Mr. Caldwell, closed the door behind him. "Mr. Carter, Principal Wilson," Caldwell began, his tone professional but clipped. "It seems we've found ourselves in a complicated situation." His eyes scanned the room before landing on Ethan. "Ethan, I've heard you've had a bit of a morning." Ethan met his gaze evenly, but his father answered first. "Complicated isn't the word I'd use," James Carter said, his voice calm but sharp. "My son was barred from taking a critical exam because of a decision that has no legal or ethical foundation. We're here to get to the bottom of it." Caldwell nodded, taking a seat at the small conference table. "Principal Wilson, would you care to explain your reasoning again? I'd like to be sure we're clear on what happened." Principal Wilson folded her hands neatly in front of her, her posture stiff. "As I've said, the school dress code prohibits clothing with political slogans. The hat Ethan wore falls under that category, and I made a judgment call to enforce the rule, especially on an exam day where maintaining focus is paramount." Ethan couldn't hold back any longer. "But it wasn't causing any distraction," he said, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "I've worn it plenty of times before. No one's ever said anything about it until today." Wilson's lips thinned. "That may be true, but tensions are higher during exams. I didn't want to take any risks." Ethan leaned forward, his voice rising slightly. "So you punished me for something that hadn't even happened yet? You made an example out of me for no reason." "Enough, Ethan," his father said gently, placing a hand on his son's arm. "Let's stay focused." He turned his attention back to Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell, my son's rights were violated today, plain and simple. Principal Wilson may believe she was acting in the best interest of the school, but her actions directly undermined Ethan's ability to express himself freely. We all know this is a public school. That means the law applies here, just like anywhere else." Caldwell exhaled, rubbing his temples. "James, you know I respect you, and I'm not here to downplay what's happened. But let's also consider the broader picture. These are difficult times. Schools are under pressure to keep peace and avoid unnecessary conflict. Principal Wilson may have been acting out of caution. James's expression didn't waver. Caution is one thing. Discrimination is another. If the school has a dress code policy, it must be enforced consistently, not selectively." The principal bristled. "This wasn't selective, wasn't it?" James cut her off, his voice still calm, but now carrying a harder edge. "Can you tell me, with certainty, that other students wearing clothing with political messages were asked to remove them today? Or any day? Or was my son singled out because his message made you uncomfortable?" The question landed like a hammer, the silence that followed deafening. Wilson opened her mouth, then closed it again, her hesitation answering the question for her. Caldwell cleared his throat, cutting through the tension. This is a serious matter, and I think it's clear we need to examine the policy more closely. For now, though, the immediate concern is resolving this situation fairly. James leaned back in his chair, satisfied for the moment. Fairness begins with allowing Ethan to retake the exam he missed. Anything less is unacceptable. Wilson stiffened. Allowing that sets a precedent. If every student who refuses to follow the rules gets a second chance— Let's not pretend this is about rules, James interrupted. If you're going to enforce them selectively, you lose the right to invoke them. My son was targeted, plain and simple, and you know it. Ethan's heart pounded as he watched the exchange. For the first time all day, he felt like someone truly had his back. Caldwell leaned forward, his expression pensive. Principal Wilson, I think it's in everyone's best interest to allow Ethan to take the exam today. That way, we avoid further escalation while we address the larger policy issues. Wilson's jaw tightened, but after a long pause, she nodded curtly. Fine, he can take the exam, but we'll be reviewing this policy immediately. Good, James said, rising to his feet and gesturing for Ethan to follow. I look forward to seeing a consistent, fair approach moving forward. As Ethan stood, his father placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. They left the office together, the tension still heavy, but the balance of power shifting. As they walked toward the exam room, Ethan glanced up at his father. Thanks, Dad, he said quietly. James smiled faintly. We're not done yet, son, but we're not backing down. The battle was far from over, but for the first time that day, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. The fight wasn't just about a hat anymore. It was about ensuring that no one else would face what he had. As Ethan and his father walked down the corridor toward the exam room, the hallways felt quieter than usual. Word of the meeting in Principal Wilson's office had spread quickly. Students peeked out from classrooms or pretended to linger by lockers, their curious eyes tracking Ethan and his father. Ethan's grip on his backpack strap tightened, the MAGA hat still tucked inside. Don't let them get to you, James Carter said, his voice low but steady. I'm not, Ethan replied, though the knot in his stomach told a different story. When they reached the exam room, a teacher standing at the door straightened awkwardly. Mr. Davis, the history teacher, gave Ethan a tight smile that felt more like an apology. Ethan, you're cleared to take the exam, he said quickly, motioning for him to enter. Ethan hesitated. Behind him, his father gave him a slight nod of encouragement. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped into the room, the hushed whispers of his classmates filling the space like static electricity. His usual seat in the middle of the room was empty. He moved toward it, the eyes of nearly every student following his every step. As he sat down and pulled out his pen, someone in the back snickered. Guess being the mayor's kid has its perks, a voice muttered just loud enough for Ethan to hear. His jaw clenched. He turned, locking eyes with Connor, a football player known for his loud opinions and louder personality. Connor, Mr. Davis said sharply, his tone cutting through the tension. Not another word, or you'll be the one leaving this room. The class fell silent again, but the air felt heavy. Ethan turned back to his desk, trying to steady his breathing. He couldn't let this throw him off, not after everything that had already happened. The test began, the sound of pencils scratching against paper the only noise in the room. Ethan focused, determined to block out the weight of the morning. The questions weren't easy, but he worked through them methodically, his preparation paying off. Midway through the test, the door creaked open. Everyone looked up as Principal Wilson stepped inside. Her presence immediately shifted the room's atmosphere. She glanced around, her gaze briefly landing on Ethan before she approached Mr. Davis and whispered something in his ear. Ethan felt his heart skip a beat. Was she about to pull him out again? Had she changed her mind? Mr. Davis nodded and turned to address the class. Keep working, everyone. This won't take long. Principal Wilson gestured for Ethan to follow her into the hallway. His classmates exchanged looks, some openly curious, others smug. Connor smirked, leaning back in his chair. Ethan rose slowly, his legs stiff, and followed her out. His father was still standing nearby, his arms crossed as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. "Principal Wilson," James said, his voice polite but firm. "I hope this interruption is necessary." She cleared her throat, her composure slipping slightly under the mayor's steady gaze. "I just wanted to speak to Ethan privately for a moment," she said, then turned to the boy. "Ethan, I wanted to make something clear. This situation, today, has escalated in ways I didn't anticipate. My decision wasn't personal." Ethan stared at her, unsure how to respond. "It felt pretty personal when you singled me out," he said finally, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath it. Wilson shifted uncomfortably. "The rule exists for a reason. I was enforcing it because I believed it was the best decision for the school." "And what about my rights?" Ethan pressed, his frustration spilling out. "Did you even think about that? Or did you just assume I wouldn't push back?" Her lips tightened. "This isn't the place for a debate, Ethan. I've already agreed to let you take your exam. But moving forward, we need to find a way to avoid situations like this." "That's easy," Ethan said, his voice rising slightly. "Stop targeting people for what they believe in. If you're going to enforce a rule, enforce it for everyone, or don't enforce it at all." James stepped in then, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. "Principal Wilson, I trust that today has been a learning experience for all of us. My son shouldn't have to defend his rights in a place that's supposed to nurture his growth. I'll be expecting to hear from you when the policy review is complete." Wilson nodded stiffly. "Of course." Ethan's father gestured for him to return to the exam room. "Go finish your test, son. We're not done here. But for now, focus on what's important." Ethan nodded and turned back toward the classroom. As he stepped inside, the whispers started again, but he ignored them, his focus narrowing to the test in front of him. From outside the door, James Carter watched him go, his expression unreadable. Principal Wilson lingered for a moment before turning on her heel and heading back to her office. The battle wasn't over, but the tides were shifting, and Ethan knew it. The whispers quieted as Ethan returned to his seat, though the tension in the room remained palpable. His classmates avoided looking directly at him, but he could feel their eyes darting in his direction whenever they thought he wasn't paying attention. The silence was oppressive, and he forced himself to focus on the test in front of him. But no matter how hard he tried, the earlier confrontation with Principal Wilson lingered in his mind. Her words had sounded rehearsed, almost mechanical, as if she were trying to smooth over a crack that everyone knew was there. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Behind him, Connor cleared his throat loudly, drawing the room's attention. Ethan didn't turn around, but he could hear the smirk in Connor's voice as he muttered, "Guess some people get to break all the rules if they got the right connections." The jab sent a ripple of tension through the room. Ethan's hand tightened around his pen, but before he could respond, Mr. Davis's voice cut through the charged air. "Connor, that's enough," he said firmly. "Focus on your test, or you can take it in detention." Connor leaned back in his chair with an exaggerated sigh, but he didn't say anything else. Ethan felt a flicker of gratitude toward Mr. Davis, though it didn't do much to ease the weight pressing down on him. The test dragged on, each question feeling heavier than the last. By the time the exam ended, Ethan was mentally and emotionally drained. He packed his things slowly, aware of the eyes on him even as his classmates shuffled out. "Ethan," Mr. Davis said as he approached his desk. "A word?" Ethan nodded reluctantly, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. He waited until the room had emptied before meeting the teacher's gaze. "I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything you've been through today," Mr. Davis began, his tone genuine. "I can't imagine how frustrating it must be." Ethan shrugged, unsure how to respond. "It's not your fault." "Maybe not," Mr. Davis said, "but I've seen this happen before. People pick battles they think are easy to win, and more often than not, it's students like you who end up caught in the middle." Ethan frowned. Students like me? Mr. Davis hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Students who aren't afraid to stand out, to be different. That makes some people uncomfortable, and unfortunately, it makes you a target. Ethan looked down at the floor, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. I didn't ask to be a target. I know, Mr. Davis said, but you handled yourself well, better than most adults would have, if I'm being honest. The compliment caught Ethan off guard. He nodded awkwardly and mumbled a quick thank you before heading for the door. As he stepped into the hallway, he spotted Emma waiting near the lockers. She smiled when she saw him, falling into step beside him as he walked. How was it? She asked. It's over, Ethan said, his voice flat. Emma studied him for a moment. You okay? Not really, Ethan admitted. It's like, no matter what I do, people are going to see me as the bad guy. I wear a hat, and suddenly I'm public enemy number one. Emma stopped walking, forcing him to stop too. Ethan, you stood up for yourself when most people wouldn't. That's not being the bad guy, that's being brave. Ethan snorted. Tell that to Connor, or Principal Wilson. Forget them, Emma said firmly. You don't need their approval. You've got people who believe in you, your dad, Mr. Davis, me, and I guarantee there are others who just haven't spoken up yet. Ethan wanted to believe her, but it was hard to shake the feeling that the battle wasn't worth the cost. As they walked toward the school's exit, he couldn't help but notice the lingering stares and hushed conversations in the hallways. Outside, James Carter was waiting by his car, his sharp gaze sweeping over the students milling about. When he saw Ethan, he gave him a nod of acknowledgement, his expression unreadable. Emma nudged him gently. Come on, your dad's waiting. Ethan sighed and followed her, the weight of the day still heavy on his shoulders. He wasn't sure what came next, but one thing was clear. This fight wasn't over. Not yet. As Ethan approached his father's car, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parking lot, he could feel the weight of the day still pressing on him. James Carter leaned casually against the sleek sedan, arms crossed, his sharp gaze scanning the students trickling out of the building. Despite his composed demeanor, Ethan could tell his father was thinking, calculating their next move. You okay? James asked as Ethan reached him. Not really, Ethan admitted. It feels like everyone's staring at me, like I'm some kind of sideshow. They'll talk for a while, James said matter-of-factly. Then they'll move on to something else. That's how these things usually go. Ethan huffed, leaning against the car. It doesn't feel like they'll move on. It feels like this is all anyone's ever going to see when they look at me. Emma joined them, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Ethan, give them time. Right now, they're all caught up in the drama, but people forget fast. Trust me. James raised an eyebrow. I wouldn't count on people forgetting, Emma. This isn't the kind of thing that just fades away, especially not when there's a bigger conversation to be had. Ethan glanced at his father, a flicker of concern crossing his face. What do you mean? James's gaze hardened slightly. The school board is going to review this policy, Ethan, but that doesn't mean the fight ends there. This isn't just about you or your hat. It's about making sure that every student, every person, knows they have the right to express themselves without fear of retaliation. Ethan frowned. And what if the board doesn't change anything? What if this just keeps happening to other people? James's expression softened, and he placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Then we keep fighting. Sometimes, standing up for what's right means playing the long game. Are you ready for that? Ethan hesitated, the enormity of his father's words settling over him. He wasn't sure he wanted to be the face of this fight, but he also knew he couldn't walk away from it now. Before he could respond, a voice cut through the air. Mr. Carter! Ethan! They turned to see Mr. Caldwell, the school board chair, striding toward them. His face was flushed, and he was clutching a folder tightly under one arm. Mr. Caldwell, James said, his tone neutral but curious. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." "I wanted to follow up before leaving for the day," Caldwell said, stopping in front of them and glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. "I've spoken with Principal Wilson, and while I've made it clear that Ethan should not have been barred from his exam, there's still some resistance to changing the policy outright." James frowned. Resistance? On what grounds? Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. "Some members of the administration feel that loosening the rules could lead to disruptions or conflicts between students. They're worried about opening the floodgates, so to speak." Ethan couldn't hold back. "But nothing happened. I wasn't disrupting anyone. The only conflict came because they made it a conflict." Caldwell raised a hand, trying to placate him. "I understand that, Ethan, and I agree with you. But convincing everyone else is going to take time." James's voice was firm. "Time isn't an excuse for inaction. The longer this policy stays ambiguous, the more students will be affected. That's unacceptable." Caldwell sighed, glancing at Ethan. "The truth is, Ethan, you've started something bigger than you realize. This incident has already caught the attention of parents, staff, and even some local media. I wouldn't be surprised if it becomes a much larger story by tomorrow." Ethan's stomach sank. "Great. Just what I need. More people talking about me." Emma stepped in. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," she said, her voice thoughtful. "If people are paying attention, maybe they'll see why this matters." Caldwell nodded. "She's right. This could be an opportunity to push for real change, but only if it's handled carefully. Ethan, people are going to want to hear from you." Ethan froze. "What do you mean, hear from me?" "Interviews," Caldwell said. "Statements. You've become the face of this issue, whether you wanted to or not. If you're willing to speak up, it could make a real difference." Ethan looked at his father, panic flickering in his eyes. "Dad, I'm not sure I'm ready for that. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I make it worse?" James's grip on his shoulder tightened reassuringly. "You've already shown more courage today than most people do in a lifetime. You don't have to have all the answers, Ethan. Just speak your truth. That's enough." Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing. He hadn't signed up for this, any of it. But as he looked at his father, at Emma, at Mr. Caldwell, he realized something. This wasn't just about him anymore. "Okay," he said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "If this is what it takes to make things right, I'll do it." Caldwell smiled faintly. "Good. I'll be in touch to coordinate." As he walked away, Ethan turned to his father. "What happens now?" James smiled, a mixture of pride and determination in his eyes. "Now, we prepare for whatever comes next." Ethan nodded, the weight of the day still heavy, but his resolve growing stronger. Whatever came next, he would face it head on. Ethan leaned against the car, staring after Mr. Caldwell as the man disappeared into the school building. The weight of what he'd just agreed to settled over him like a heavy coat. Emma and his father remained silent for a moment, giving him the space to process. "Do you think this is really going to change anything?" Ethan finally asked, his voice quiet but edged with doubt. James Carter's expression was steady as he replied, "It can. Change starts with small things, Ethan. Moments like this. But it depends on whether you're willing to see it through." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, the familiar tension creeping in. I didn't think this would get so big. It was just a hat. I didn't want to start a movement or whatever this is turning into." Emma stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "It was never just a hat, Ethan. People see what they want to see in things like that. You standing up for yourself means more than you realize." Ethan let her words sink in but didn't reply. Instead, he looked at his father, whose calm demeanor gave him a sliver of comfort. "So what now?" Before James could answer, a voice interrupted. "Hey, Carter!" Ethan turned to see Connor and a couple of his football teammates walking across the parking lot. Connor's smirk was as irritating as ever, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby students. "Got your daddy fighting your battles for you, huh?" Connor sneered. "Bet that feels real good, doesn't it?" Ethan clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists. Emma stepped forward, but James put a hand on her shoulder, stopping her. "Let him handle this," James said quietly. Connor took another step closer, his friends laughing behind him. "You think you're some kind of hero now? Newsflash, Carter. Nobody cares about your stupid hat. You're just making a fool of yourself." Ethan's heart pounded, his frustration boiling over. For a moment, he considered snapping back, throwing something that might finally shut Connor up. But then he remembered his father's advice from earlier. Speak your truth. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped forward, meeting Connor's gaze head-on. "You're right," he said, his voice steady. "It's just a hat. But the way this school reacted to it says a lot about how scared people are of different opinions. If you don't get that, maybe you're the one making a fool of yourself." Connor blinked, clearly not expecting the calm reply. His smirk faltered for a moment before he scoffed and turned to his friends. "Whatever, man. You're not worth it." As the group walked away, Ethan exhaled, the tension in his chest loosening slightly. He turned back to his father, who nodded approvingly. "Well done," James said. "That's how you stand your ground without losing control." Emma grinned. "That was amazing. Did you see his face? He didn't know what to do." Ethan allowed himself a small smile, though his mind was still racing. The encounter had rattled him more than he wanted to admit, but it also made him realize something. This wasn't just about the school or the policy anymore. It was about how people like Connor saw him and how he saw himself. As they got into the car and drove away, Ethan stared out the window, his thoughts spinning. The fight wasn't over, and he still wasn't sure how far he was willing to go. But for the first time, he felt like he was starting to understand what this fight really meant and why it mattered. The car ride home was quiet at first, the hum of the engine filling the silence. Ethan stared out the window, the scenery blurring past as his mind replayed everything that had happened. His father drove with a calm focus, but Ethan could tell James was thinking just as hard as he was. Emma sat in the back, scrolling on her phone, though every so often she glanced up at Ethan, as if trying to gauge how he was holding up. Finally, James broke the silence. "You handled yourself well with Connor back there." Ethan shrugged. "I just didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose it." "That's exactly the point," James replied. "Sometimes the best way to win is to keep your cool. People like Connor are looking for a reaction. When you don't give it to them, you take away their power." Ethan nodded but didn't reply. The knot in his stomach had loosened slightly, but it still lingered. Emma leaned forward, holding her phone out. You might want to see this." Ethan frowned and took the phone. On the screen was a social media post. One of his classmates had apparently snapped a picture of him walking into the school board meeting with his dad. The caption read, "When your dad's the mayor, you get to break all the rules." The post had already racked up dozens of comments, some supportive, but others dripping with sarcasm and mockery. Ethan handed the phone back, his face heating up. "Great, just what I needed." Emma gave him a sympathetic look. "People are going to talk no matter what, Ethan. You can't control that." James glanced at them through the rearview mirror. "Emma's right, but remember, the more noise people make, the more attention this issue gets. That's not a bad thing." "It doesn't feel like a good thing," Ethan muttered. They pulled into the driveway, the familiar sight of their house offering a small sense of relief. But as they stepped inside, the first thing Ethan noticed was the ringing of the house phone. His mom, standing in the kitchen, answered it quickly, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern as she listened. "James," she said, holding the phone out toward her husband. "It's the local news station. They want to talk to you about what happened at the school today." Ethan froze. "The news? Are you serious?" James took the phone, his tone measured as he greeted the caller. Ethan couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but his dad's calm responses only made his nerves worse. After a few minutes, James hung up and turned to face them. "They're running a story tonight," he said. "They want to include a statement from you, Ethan." Ethan's eyes widened. "What? Why me?" "Because you're the one at the center of this," James replied. "They want to hear your perspective, what this means to you and why you stood your ground." Emma grinned. "This is huge, Ethan. You get to tell your side of the story." But Ethan wasn't smiling. His pulse quickened, and his hands clenched into fists. "I don't know if I can do that. What if I mess up? What if I say the wrong thing and make it worse?" James stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "You won't mess up. You've already shown that you can speak with honesty and courage. That's all anyone can ask for." Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. The idea of speaking to a news station made his stomach churn, but deep down, he knew this was his chance to set the record straight. "What do I even say?" he asked finally. "You tell the truth," James said. "You tell them why you wore the hat, what it means to you, and why it's important for everyone to have the right to express themselves. Speak from your heart, Ethan. That's what matters." Ethan took a deep breath, his nerves still buzzing but his resolve starting to solidify. "Okay, let's do it." Emma clapped him on the shoulder. "That's the spirit. And don't worry, I'll help you practice." James smiled faintly. "You've got this, son. Just remember, the truth is on your side." As they sat down to prepare for the interview, Ethan felt a mix of fear and determination. The fight wasn't over, and the spotlight was now squarely on him. But for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, the weight of what was coming sinking in as Emma opened her laptop. James leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching his son with quiet encouragement. Ethan's mother, Sarah, busied herself making tea, though Ethan could tell she was paying attention to every word. "So," Emma began, her fingers flying over the keys, "if the news station is asking for your statement, they'll probably want you to focus on the big picture. Why this happened, what it means to you, and what you think should change." Ethan rubbed his temples. "I get that, but how do I even start? If I screw this up, it's not just me. They're going to spin it however they want." "They might try," James said calmly. "But if you speak clearly and with conviction, they'll have a hard time twisting your words. Keep it simple and stick to what you know." Sarah placed a steaming cup of tea in front of Ethan, her voice soft but steady. "You've always been good at explaining how you feel when it matters. Trust yourself, Ethan. You're stronger than you think." Emma turned the laptop toward him. "I typed up some questions they might ask, so you can practice. First one. Why did you choose to wear the hat to school today?" Ethan stared at the screen for a moment, feeling the pressure of the question. "Because I believe in what it stands for," he said slowly. "Not everyone has to agree with me, but it's my way of expressing myself." Emma nodded. "Good start. Now, what if they ask, do you think wearing the hat was worth all this controversy?" Ethan hesitated, then frowned. "Honestly, I didn't think it would turn into this big of a deal. But now that it has, I guess, yeah, it was worth it. If this gets people to talk about free speech and how schools handle it, then maybe something good will come out of it." James smiled faintly. "That's the right attitude. Keep going." Emma tapped the next question. "What do you say to people who feel the hat is offensive or represents something they don't agree with?" This one gave Ethan pause. He thought back to Connor's taunts, the whispers in the hallways, and Principal Wilson's stony expression. He exhaled slowly. "I'd say that just because you don't like something doesn't mean it shouldn't exist. I didn't wear it to hurt anyone or start a fight. I wore it because it means something to me. But that doesn't mean I don't respect other people's feelings. I just wish they'd respect mine too." Emma gave him a thumbs up. "Now we're talking. See? You're a natural." Ethan let out a shaky laugh. "Yeah, sure. a natural at overthinking everything. Before anyone could respond, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway caught their attention. Sarah walked to the window and peeked out. "It's a reporter," she said, her voice laced with surprise. "I thought they'd call before showing up." James straightened. "Let me handle this." He moved toward the door, but Ethan stood up abruptly. "Number, I'll do it." James turned, his eyebrows raised. "Are you sure?" Ethan nodded, his pulse quickening. "Yeah. If this is my fight, I need to start acting like it." Emma gave him a supportive smile. "You've got this, Ethan." Ethan took a deep breath and walked to the door. The reporter, a woman in her 30s with a notepad and a cameraman in tow, greeted him with a professional but eager smile. "Ethan Carter?" she asked. "I'm Rachel Brooks with Channel 7 News. We'd like to ask you a few questions about what happened at school today, if that's okay." Ethan glanced back at his dad, who gave him a reassuring nod. "Yeah, that's okay," he said, stepping outside and closing the door behind him. Rachel gestured to the cameraman, who started rolling. "Ethan, can you tell us in your own words what led to this situation?" Ethan swallowed hard, then began. "I wore a MAGA hat to school today, like I've done before, but this time, the principal said it violated the dress code, even though nothing about the dress code says I can't wear it. She told me to take it off or leave, so I left." Rachel nodded, jotting notes as he spoke. "Some people argue that symbols like the MAGA hat can be divisive. What's your response to that?" Ethan's voice steadied as he replied, "I get that not everyone agrees with what the hat stands for. But if we're going to start banning things because they make people uncomfortable, where does it stop? Schools should teach us how to handle different opinions, not shut them down." Rachel smiled slightly, impressed by his composure. "And what would you like to see happen next?" "I want the school to take a hard look at how they enforce their policies," Ethan said firmly. "If there's going to be a rule, it should apply to everyone, not just people they disagree with. And I want students to know it's okay to stand up for themselves when something isn't right." The cameraman signaled that the recording had ended, and Rachel lowered her notepad. "Thank you, Ethan. That was very well said. We'll make sure your perspective is included in tonight's broadcast." As they left, Ethan let out a long breath, the tension in his chest easing slightly. James and Emma stepped outside to join him. "You were amazing," Emma said, grinning. James placed a hand on his shoulder. "You handled that like a pro. I'm proud of you." Ethan nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. For the first time all day, he felt a glimmer of confidence. The road ahead might still be uncertain, but at least now, he knew he could face it.